The rain had been falling for 3 days, not the gentle kind that softens the earth and coaxes things to grow. This was the cold, indifferent rain of early Montana autumn, the kind that had no interest in whether you lived or died, the kind that simply fell because falling was its nature, and everything beneath it was left to manage on its own. Cecily Brandt had stopped managing somewhere around the second day. She walked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant the depot in Harlow Creek where she had waited for 2 days on a wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap, watching every man who came near the platform, looking for a blue kerchief, a nervous smile, a rancher who had written her letters full of careful words for 3 months and promised to be standing there when she stepped off the train. No one had come. So she walked. The road west of Harlow Creek was nothing more than 2 ruts pressed into the earth by wagon wheels and stubbornness. The grass on either side had gone the color of old straw. The mountains in the distance were invisible behind low gray cloud. Cecily could not see more than a 1/4 mile in any direction, and in every direction there was nothing but the same flat, indifferent emptiness that had swallowed her whole since she crossed into Montana territory. Her shoes had given out that morning. She had known they would. She had felt the right sole loosening 2 days ago, felt the way it caught on stones and lifted slightly with each step, and she had pressed on anyway because there was nothing else to do. By dawn, the leather had separated entirely at the toe, and now with each step the cold mud pressed up through the gap and against the bare skin of her foot, a sensation so consistently unpleasant that she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that never changes. The valise in her right hand weighed 11 pounds. She knew this because she had waited at the post office in Cincinnati before she left, weighed it on the brass scale behind the counter while the clerk watched with mild curiosity, and she remembered thinking that 11 pounds was not very much for a life. A change of clothes, her mother's handkerchief, worn thin at the edges from years of washing, a small book of household remedies she had copied out in her own hand from the one her grandmother had kept, $3.40 in coin, and the letters, tied with kitchen string, the paper already softening from the humidity of her grip. She had not looked at the letters since the first day. She did not look at them now, yet she simply walked, and the rain fell on her shoulders and ran down the back of her neck and soaked through the blue calico of her dress until the fabric was the color of night, and she told herself that she was not cold because being cold required a kind of attention she could not spare. She had tried in the early part of the second day to calculate what her options were. The station master in Harlow Creek had told her there was a westbound train in 11 days, but she had no money for a return ticket, no money for a room, and no one in Cincinnati to return to. The boarding house on Malone Street had already let her room to someone else. The Morrison Mill would take her back, probably, if she showed up at the employment office with her hat in her hands, but the hat was in the valise and the showing up would require a ticket she could not buy. And in any case, she had sold everything she owned to make this trip, and there was nothing left to sell. The accounting always came out the same way. She had nowhere to go, not back, not forward, not anywhere that had a name. So she put one foot in front of the other and she walked, and the road went on, and the mountains stayed invisible, and the rain did not stop. It was the horse that stopped first. She heard it before she saw it, the creak of leather and the soft blow of breath through nostrils, and she turned her head slowly, because turning her head quickly required energy she had already spent. The rider came out of the gray curtain of rain like something the weather had simply decided to produce. A big man on a dark horse, both of them equally wet, both of them regarding her with the same expression, which was not quite pity and not quite suspicion, but something in between that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. The horse stopped. The man did not pull the reins hard. The horse simply stopped on its own, planting its feet in the mud 10 yards ahead of her and refusing to go further, as if it had made a decision that its rider had not yet reached. Animals did that sometimes, Cecily knew. They saw things that had not yet resolved themselves in human terms. The man looked down at her. She looked up at him. His hat brim had channeled the rain into a steady stream that fell from the front edge in a thin curtain. His coat was dark with water. His face was the kind of face that had spent 20 years outdoors, not old exactly, but weathered past what his years strictly called for. The skin drawn tight over the bones of his jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes deep and permanent. He was perhaps 38 years old. He looked older and younger at the same time, older in the way of someone who had stopped expecting comfort from the world, younger in the way of someone who had never fully believed he deserved it. The combination was not uncommon in men who lived alone in open country for a long time. The land had a way of stripping things down. "Where are you headed?" His voice came out rough, not unkind. The voice of a man who did not speak often enough to keep the instrument well oiled. Cecily opened her mouth. She had been rehearsing this answer in her head for 2 days, turning it over and over, trying to find the version that sounded least like what it was, which was nothing, which was nowhere, which was that she had no answer. She said nothing. The rain streamed down her face. She had been out in it so long that she no longer felt individual drops, only the collective weight of water that had claimed her as its own. "I don't know anymore." The words came out flat and accurate. Not a plea, not a performance. Simply a statement of fact from a woman who had used up every other kind of statement she owned. The man looked toward the west, then back at her. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation she could not read, a weighing of things she was not party to. He reached down his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something you have stopped trusting. Not because the thing itself has failed you, but because your own judgment has failed you before, and you are no longer sure the two can be separated. She had trusted her judgment once about what a letter meant and what a man meant by the words he put in it, and she had been wrong in ways that had cost her everything she had accumulated in 30 years of careful living. She took it anyway. His grip was dry and very warm, the palm rough with calluses, in the specific places that come from years of rope and reins, and he pulled her up onto the horse behind him with the efficiency of someone who had done practical things all his life and saw no reason to make them complicated. The horse shifted once beneath the new weight, then steadied. Cecily held the valise against her ribs with one arm. With her other hand, she held the back of the man's coat, not tightly, not loosely, the grip of someone who had decided to trust one more time and was reserving judgment on whether that had been wise. His name was Arden Voss. She would not learn this for another half hour. The cabin sat at the base of a low rise a mile from the road, sheltered on the north side by a stand of cottonwoods that had gone mostly yellow. From a distance it looked like what it was, a place where one person lived alone and had stopped performing the rituals of welcome because there was no one to welcome. The porch rail needed repainting. The small kitchen garden by the south wall was choked with late-season weeds. A horse stood in the corral beside the barn, watching their approach with the mild interest of an animal who had grown accustomed to seeing very little and had adjusted its expectations accordingly. Inside was worse. not filthy, not beyond redemption, but the specific kind of disorder that accumulates when a person has been left with the full weight of their own company for too long. Dust on every flat surface, dishes in the basin that had sat long enough to calcify, shirts draped over the backs of chairs, waiting for someone to return them to somewhere they belonged. A coffee pot on the stove that had gone so long between cleanings that the outside had taken on a permanent shade of dark brown. The whole place had the look of a space that had once been cared for and knew it, that remembered some earlier version of itself and was waiting, without much hope, for someone to remember it too. Arden fed the stove. He moved through his own kitchen the way a man moves through a space he uses but does not inhabit, efficiently and without looking at it directly, as if prolonged attention might require him to feel something about it. He pulled a wool blanket from the back room and held it out without looking at her face. "Get warm." Cecily took it. The wool smelled of cedar and something older, the ghost of a perfume or a soap that belonged to someone no longer present in the room. She wrapped it around her shoulders and stood dripping on the floorboards while Arden poured coffee into a tin cup, black and thick enough to strip paint, and set it on the table. She sat on the stool so nearest the fire. The heat from the stove pressed against her wet clothes and raised steam from the fabric. The room filled slowly with the smell of wet wool and mud, and underneath it, very faintly, like a memory that does not want to be examined, something that might have been lavender from a sachet packed long ago in that valise she had been carrying for 3 days. Arden sat across from her. He did not ask questions. He simply sat with his coffee and looked at the stove in the way of a man who had learned that silence was the most reliable thing on offer and saw no reason to replace it with something inferior. He did not perform discomfort, and he did not perform ease. He was simply present, and it occurred to Cecily that she could not remember the last time she had been in the company of someone whose presence required nothing of her. Not since her father, perhaps, who had been that kind of person, the rare kind whose quiet was a gift rather than a demand. Cecily's hands stopped shaking somewhere during the second cup. When she spoke, it was because she had decided to, not because she owed him an explanation, not because silence had become uncomfortable, but because he had brought her in from the rain without asking what she was worth. And that kind of unreasoned decency deserved at least the truth. She told it to him plainly. Cincinnati. The Morrison Textile Mill. 12 hours a day for 12 years. The sound of the looms, a permanent presence in her hearing, even in sleep. Her parents taken by scarlet fever in the same week when she was 17, the house sold to pay the debts. Nothing left but a trunk of clothes and a grandmother's book of remedies, and the knowledge that no one was coming to do this for her. 12 years of doing it herself, and nothing to show for it except a small amount of savings and the competence that hardship produces in people who decide to be produced by it rather than destroyed by it. 3 months ago, she had seen the advertisement in the back pages of a Cincinnati paper. Montana rancher, it had read, seeking a wife, hardworking and sincere. She had answered it because she was both of those things, and because the alternative was 40 more years of textile work and a room above a boarding house that smelled of other people's cooking. They had written letters for 3 months. Careful letters, specific letters, letters that spoke of the ranch east of town, the good land and the clean air. A man who said he had been waiting a long time for the right person and believed he had found her. He had described the kitchen with its south-facing window. He had described the way the light fell on the mountains at evening. He had written, in his 3rd letter, that he had not realized how quiet his life had become until he started receiving hers, and that sentence had undone her entirely, because it was true of her own life too, and she had not known until that moment that she had been waiting for someone to say it. She had sold everything she owned to buy the train ticket. One way. She had waited 2 days at the depot, slept on the wooden bench, asked for water at the station master's office, which was given to her with the expression of a man who had already formed an opinion and did not intend to revise it. Then she had started walking because waiting had stopped being a strategy. His name, she said, was Fletcher Holm. She lifted the letters from the valise and set them on the table between them, the string still tied, the paper gone soft at the edges from 3 days of moisture and handling. Arden went very still. Not the stillness of a person hearing something surprising, the stillness of a person hearing something they already half knew and had been hoping not to have confirmed. His jaw tightened. He looked at the letters, then at the stove, then at nothing in particular on the surface of the table. He did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice came out careful in the way of someone choosing each word the way you choose where to put your foot when the ground is uncertain. Fletcher Holm runs the general store in town. Has a wife named Dorothea. 2 children. House with a white fence on Carpenter Street. He's got no ranch. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight and texture, the specific quality of silence that occurs when something a person has been refusing to believe becomes undeniable and there is nothing left to do but let it be true. Cecily did not cry. She had spent a great deal of energy over the past 3 days not crying, and she had gotten very good at it. She looked at the letters on the table for a long moment, her face doing the work of someone who has received a blow and is deciding whether to acknowledge it or simply absorb it and continue moving. She had spent her whole adult life making that decision, usually in favor of absorbing, and the muscle memory of it was strong. Then she stood up, picked up the letters, and crossed to the stove. She opened the iron door. She fed the letters in one at a time, not quickly, not slowly. With the deliberate, even pace of someone completing a task that had to be done and saw no reason to add drama to necessity. The paper curled immediately in the heat, the careful ink blackening and then disappearing. 3 months of words reduced to ash in a matter of seconds. She watched each letter go. She did not look away. Some things deserve to be witnessed, even when the witnessing costs something. When the last one was gone, she closed the stove door. She stood there for a moment with her back to him. Then she turned around. I don't have anywhere to go. The words were not a plea. They were not a performance of helplessness designed to move him. They were simply what was true, stated plainly by a woman who had long ago learned that stating things plainly was more reliable than hoping people would guess correctly. Arden sat at the table with both hands wrapped around his cup. He looked at her for a long moment, this woman standing in his kitchen in a wet calico dress, with steam rising from her shoulders and her chin at an angle that said she would absorb whatever came next without flinching. Whatever it was, she had practice. He looked at the stove, then back at her. The spare room has a lock, keys on the inside. He did not say you can stay. He did not make a speech about charity or propriety or what the town would think. He simply said where the key was and returned his attention to his coffee, as if the matter was settled and there was nothing more to be said about it. There wasn't. Cecily Brant picked up her valise, walked to the door of the spare room, and stepped inside. The room held a narrow bed, a small table, a window that faced east toward the cottonwoods. The mattress was thin, and the quilt was old, and the whole space, smelled of cedar and long disuse. But there was no crack in the plaster wide enough to let the wind through, and the floor was solid under her feet, and the window glass was whole. She set the valise down against the wall. She sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the rain continued its conversation with the roof, steady and without mercy. The stove ticked as the metal expanded with the heat. From the kitchen, she could hear the quiet sounds of a man sitting alone with his coffee, not leaving, not speaking, simply present the way solid things are present, without announcement, without apology. Cecily looked at the wall. She had come 2,000 miles on a promise that had turned out to be smoke. She had walked 40 miles through country that did not care whether she arrived. She had stood on a platform for 2 days watching every face that passed, and none of them were his. She had burned his letters in a stranger's stove in a stranger's kitchen in a town where no one knew her name. And yet, the room had a lock. The key was on the inside. She reached out and turned it. The small, clean sound of the bolt sliding home was the first thing in 3 days that had felt entirely, specifically right. Not fine. Not manageable. Right. There was a difference, and she had not felt it in long enough that the recognition of it moved through her like warmth from a stove, spreading from the center outward, reaching even the cold places. She lay down on top of the quilt without removing her boots. Outside, the cottonwoods bent in the wind. The mountains were somewhere in the dark beyond the window, enormous and indifferent and utterly unchanged by any of this. The rain fell on the roof of the cabin and on the barn and on the road west of Harlow Creek, where her footprints were already filling with water, erasing the evidence that she had been there at all. Somewhere in the kitchen, a chair moved. Then silence. Cecily closed her eyes. She did not know this man. She did not know this place. She had 11 pounds of possessions and $3.40 and a skill for sewing and a knowledge of household remedies and a capacity for work that 12 years in a textile mill had beaten into her bones so deeply it had become indistinguishable from character. It was not much, but she had started with less. She was asleep before the lamp in the kitchen went out. In the morning, there would be questions she could not yet answer, a town that had already started forming opinions, and a man sitting alone in his kitchen who had not spoken to anyone about anything that mattered in longer than he could accurately remember. But that was morning. Tonight the rain fell on the cabin and the lock was turned, and for the first time in 3 days, Cecily Brant was somewhere that had 4 walls and a roof and a door that opened from the inside. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. The smell reached him before he was fully awake. Arden lay on his back in the gray pre-dawn light and stared at the ceiling and tried to identify what was different about the morning. The stove was lit. He could hear the low crackle of it from the other room, the particular sound of a fire that had been built with patience and attention, fed from good coals in the right order, not the rough catch and sputter of something assembled in haste by someone who wanted heat without wanting to earn it. And underneath the wood smoke, there was something else, something warm and particular that did not belong to the present version of his life, but to an earlier one. A version so far back that the memory of it arrived not as image or thought, but as pure sensation, as the specific feeling of being a child who wakes and understands without opening his eyes that someone who loves him is already awake and has already decided that he will be cared for. Cornbread. He lay still for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he pulled on his boots and walked out of the back room and stopped in the doorway between the hall and the kitchen. The table had been cleared. Not simply wiped down in the way a person wipes a surface they intend to use, but cleared in the deeper sense, emptied of everything that had settled onto it over months of solitary inattention. The newspapers and the broken harness buckle, and the 3 candle stubs, and the coffee ring that had been there so long it had become part of the grain of the wood. All of it was gone, put away or set aside in stacks against the wall with the orderly logic of a person who had looked at the disorder and seen not chaos but a series of small problems, each with a straightforward solution. The dishes that had sat in the basin for the better part of a week were washed and dried and arranged on the shelf with a consistency of spacing that suggested the arrangement was not accidental. The shirts he had draped over the chairbacks were gone, folded somewhere. The window above the basin had been wiped down with something, vinegar by the smell of it, faint and clean, and the morning light came through the glass differently than it had the day before, with less resistance, as if the window had been holding something back that it was only now willing to release. Cecily stood at the stove with her back to him. She wore the blue calico dress, dry now and smoothed as flat as a dress can be smoothed without an iron. The fabric still faded at the shoulders from years of washing, but clean and decent and worn with the unself-conscious dignity of a woman who has never had the luxury of caring too much about what she has to wear and has therefore decided not to care about it at all. She had tied one of his old aprons around her waist, the strings going twice around because there was more apron than strictly necessary for a woman her size, and she had knotted it at the front in a way that was practical and inadvertently neat. Her hair was pinned up tightly at the back of her head with the thoroughness of someone who has made a decision about her hair and does not intend to revisit it before noon. She did not turn around when he came in. "I don't take charity. I work for my keep." Her voice was flat and even and carried no apology and no aggression, simply the statement of a person establishing a fact that they consider important to have established. She said it the way people say things they have said before, in other rooms, to other people, things they have learned to say early and clearly, so there is no confusion later about the terms. Arden stood in the doorway. He looked at the clean table. He looked at the arranged dishes on the shelf. He looked at the woman who had been in his cabin for 2 days and had apparently spent them making it into something closer to what it had been before he stopped trying. He did not know what to do with his hands, which was not a new problem for him, but which felt more pronounced this morning than usual. He crossed to the table and sat down. She set the cornbread in front of him, round and golden, the top cracked faintly down the center the way cornbread cracks when it has been made correctly, the edges pulling away from the iron in the thin, dark line that means the heat was right. Beside it, she placed a cup of coffee, black and strong, the way he took it, though he had said nothing to her about how he took it. She sat across from him with her own cup and looked out the window at the cottonwoods and did not watch him eat. This was the most considerate thing anyone had done for him in recent memory. The not watching. The giving him the privacy of his own face while he dealt with what the food was doing to him, which was more than it should have been able to do. It tasted the way his mother's had tasted, not approximately, not in the way that any decent cornbread recalls another decent cornbread, but precisely, the exact same balance of salt and sweetness, the same texture at the center, the same slight crispness at the edge that he had eaten every morning of the first 14 years of his life, and then never again. He ate slowly. He chewed with more attention than eating usually asked of him. He tried to understand what it was about the proportions of salt and fat and meal that could carry 24 years through them as clearly as a letter, as clearly as a voice. He did not eat the last piece. He left it on the plate and pushed back from the table and went out to the barn without explanation, which was not something he owed her and not something she asked for. And the uneaten piece of cornbread sat on the plate in the quiet kitchen like a thing he was not yet ready to let be finished. He stayed in the barn longer than the horses required. On the third day, she found the root cellar. He came around the back of the cabin mid-morning to find the cellar door standing open and the sound of Cecily moving below on the packed earth floor, the lamp she had taken from the kitchen throwing unsteady light up through the opening. He stood at the top of the steps and looked down. She was conducting an inventory. He could tell by the way she moved, shelf to shelf, methodical and unhurried, lifting jar lids and replacing them, pressing her thumb against the surface of things to test their firmness, holding the lamp close to examine what the eye could not determine from a distance. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was establishing what existed, which is the thing a person does when they are beginning to think seriously about time. Half these preserves have gone to mold. He had known this in the passive way that you know things you have chosen not to examine. Probably. The lamp was still for a moment. Then it began moving again, slow and thorough. The carrots are good. Potatoes want sorting before they turn each other. There is enough here to see the winter through if someone pays attention between now and November. The word someone occupied the air between them without either of them commenting on it. It was not a small word. It had a specific gravity, that word, when said in a root cellar in October by a woman who was not yet sure she would still be there when the cold arrived. He went back to his work. That evening, the table held 4 jars of salvageable preserves and a piece of flour sacking on which she had written in a clear economical hand a complete inventory of the root cellar contents, organized by category and condition, with notes on what would keep and what would not, and at the bottom a second shorter list headed simply, "What is needed?" Arden picked it up and read it twice. The handwriting was confident and unhesitating, each letter the same size as the others, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who has spent time writing things that had to be read correctly. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and pressed his hand flat against the outside of it, not quite sure what he was doing. He was not sure what he intended to do with it there. He kept it for 3 days. On the 6th day, he found her at the window. He had come in from the fence line earlier than expected, a stone bruise developing on the bay mare's left front hoof that wanted attention before the temperature dropped and turned a manageable problem into something worse. He pushed open the cabin door and stopped just inside it without having planned to stop. Cecily was sitting in the chair by the south window. It was his mother's chair, not in the sense of legal ownership, but in the sense that his mother had sat in it every afternoon of her adult life in this cabin and had left something of herself in it, the way people leave impressions in the things they use daily and love without remarking on it. The chair caught the best of the afternoon light. His mother had known this. Cecily had apparently discovered it on her own, by the same instinct that causes certain people to always find the warmest corner of a room without being told where it is. It was the same chair. It was the same window. The light fell the same way it had always fallen. She had found the pile of his work shirts. He had shoved them into the corner of the front room in the spring and not thought about them again. The shirts with the split elbows and the missing buttons and the shoulder seam on the good wool one that had given out in February and been addressed by his simply not wearing it. He had told himself he would get to them. He had not gotten to them. Cecily had gotten to them. The needle moved in the afternoon light with the unhurried precision of someone for whom this kind of work was not a task undertaken but a language spoken, learned so young that it had bypassed the layer of consciousness where things are decided and settled into the deeper layer where things are simply done. Her lower lip caught between her teeth when the thread tangled. She worked it free with 2 small movements and continued without breaking the rhythm. The light through the south window caught the loose hair at her temples and turned it to copper. Arden stood in the doorway and did not move. His mother had sat in that chair with that light on her face and her hands moving in that same patient way. She had hummed while she worked, old hymns from Pennsylvania, tunes that had traveled west with her in the wagon and never entirely naturalized to the Montana air, remaining always slightly out of place and entirely themselves, like their singer. He had stopped hearing them in the way you stop hearing anything that is always present. He had not understood what he had stopped hearing until it was gone. He understood it now. Cecily did not hum. Her hands moved the same way, though. The same patience, the same quality of attention, as if each stitch was a small choice made correctly, as if the act of mending was not just about the shirt, but about something larger, some ongoing argument she was having with the idea that broken things must stay broken. These aren't fit for rags. When did you last mend anything? Don't recall. She pulled the thread through and said nothing further, which communicated everything she might have said if she had chosen to say it. He went back outside and sat on the porch steps and braided a length of rope he had no immediate use for. His hands worked harder than the task required. He kept his eyes pointed at the fence line, at the cottonwoods losing their leaves in the slow, irregular way of trees that are not in a hurry, at the mountains to the north, standing pale blue and enormous against the afternoon sky. He looked through the window many times. The afternoon light shifted by degrees, and she stayed in the chair and her hands kept moving, and neither of them acknowledged any of this, which was a kind of conversation in itself, conducted entirely without words, and understood by both parties with a clarity that words might have made less certain. On the 10th morning, she asked about the flowers. Could I plant some flowers by the porch steps? Arden set his coffee cup down. The question was small in the way that certain small things are not small at all. It assumed a future. Not a vague future, but a specific one. A future in which she was here past the planting and here again past the growing, and here at the point when whatever she put in the ground came up and showed itself. He had not agreed to that future. He had not refused it either. It had simply been accumulating around him one day at a time, like weather that builds without announcing itself. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Plant what you want. She gave a single nod and went back to her coffee. That afternoon, Arden found unnecessary work to do on the south fence, 20 feet from where Cecily knelt beside the porch rail in the dry September dirt with his old hand spade and a serious expression. She had pushed her sleeves past her elbows. Her fingers were dark with soil to the second knuckle. She placed each small bulb into the earth with a deliberateness that seemed larger than the act, pressing the dirt back over it with her palm in the careful way of someone who understands that what they are burying is not gone, but only changed in form and will come back different and better than it went in. He drove a fence post into ground that did not need a fence post. He struck it harder than necessary each time. He told himself he was checking the tension on the wire. He was not checking the tension on the wire. Once she caught him. Her face turned up at exactly the moment his eyes were on her and stayed level, not looking away, not pretending she had not seen. He brought the mallet down on the post with a force that he felt in his shoulders for the rest of the afternoon, and when he permitted himself to look back, she had returned to her planting, but the corners of her mouth had done something brief and unmistakable. A movement so small it might have been nothing. A movement so precise It could not have been anything else. She knew. He stayed at that fence post until the light began to go, which was considerably longer than the fence post required. On the 14th evening, she used the good plates. Arden owned very little that could be called good in the sense of fine or deliberate. But among his few possessions were 2 china plates his mother had carried west from Pennsylvania in a crate packed with straw and extraordinary optimism. White plates with a border of small blue flowers. The kind of thing that survives a wagon journey through sheer force of being handled by someone who knows the value of what they are carrying. They lived on the highest shelf behind the everyday tin, and he had not taken them down since his mother had last used them, which was before everything ended, before he was 14 and alone, and the cabin was suddenly only his. They were on the table when he came in from the barn. A candle burned in the center. Not a declaration, not a ceremony. Simply light placed where it was needed, where it happened to be warm and steady. You look troubled this morning. Thought a proper supper might help. He sat down. She served beans seasoned with salt pork and a slow measure of molasses, the cornbread with its crisp edge and soft center, coffee poured without being requested. She settled across the table from him with the ease of someone who has been sitting at this particular table through many seasons and sees no reason to approach it with ceremony. They ate without speaking. He said nothing about the plates. He looked at them once when he sat down, the blue flowers at the rim, and felt the thing move through him that always moved through him when he encountered the objects his mother had touched. The particular grief of a person who has kept things because getting rid of them would be a kind of murder, and who handles them rarely for the same reason. But the plates were on the table, not stored, not preserved against damage behind other dishes on the high shelf. On the table, holding food, doing what plates are made to do. He thought about this while he ate and did not find an objection to it. There was something right about it that he could not quite name, something that had to do with things being used for their purpose, with the idea that preservation was not always the same as love. Jasper Nell arrived on the morning of October 5th on his gray gelding, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been making the same rounds for so long that the route itself has become a kind of thinking. Arden came around the side of the barn when he heard the horse. Cecily was on the porch with the broom she had stopped moving. Jasper Nell was 70 years old. His beard was the white of long winters, and his spectacles, thick-lensed and wire-framed, gave his eyes the quality of things viewed through water, present but distorted, there but not quite arrived. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man whose vision had been declining for years in ways he had not fully tracked, which meant the gap between what he saw and what he believed he saw had been quietly widening without his knowledge, a gap that other people could make use of if they understood its dimensions and had reason to. He touched his hat brim. "Morning, Arden." "Jasper." The old man did not dismount. His eyes moved to the porch, to Cecily, and stayed there for a moment with the unfocused attention of a man trying to bring something into resolution that his eyes will not quite permit. "Figured you ought to know. Bank was robbed 2 nights past. Harlow Creek Bank. Only one we got. Cleaned the safe and gone before dawn. $3,000 to $200. Arden felt the stillness arrive in him, the specific stillness of information that reconfigures the landscape you thought you understood. Anybody hurt? Nobody hurt. But folks are worked up considerably. Sheriff Crane is asking questions. Everyone who came through town in the past 2 weeks. He paused in the way of a man who has learned that the pause is where the meaning lives. His eyes went back to the porch. They settled on Cecily with the slow consideration of someone trying to bring a face into focus, lingering past the point of simple recognition, past the point of courtesy, into the territory of appraisal. Thought you should know. Arden heard the repetition for what it was, not emphasis. The first saying had been the news. The second saying was something else, a door left slightly open, an implication extended without full commitment. The kind of thing a person says when they want to have said it, but do not want to be held to having said it. Appreciate it. Jasper gathered his reins and turned the gelding toward the road. At the bend, he looked back once, the thick glass of his spectacles catching the morning light and returning it blankly. And then he was gone, absorbed into the dry grass and the wide, indifferent distance of the valley. Arden stood at the fence until the sound of the horse had faded entirely. Then he turned. Cecily had come down from the porch. She stood in the yard with the broom at her side, watching the empty road with her chin at the angle that meant she had heard everything and was deciding what to do with it. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the meadowlark on the east fence post sang its bright, oblivious song into the silence between them. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would not be either too much or too little. Go inside. I'll be in directly. She went without argument, her footsteps even on the porch boards, the screen door closing behind her with its familiar sound. He stood alone in the yard under the hard blue October sky and turned over what he knew and what he suspected, and the two lists were uncomfortably close in length. He picked up the splitting maul. He split wood until his arms ached and the pile beside the barn was tall enough for 3 weeks of hard cold, and the splitting did not make him feel better or worse, but it gave his hands something to do, and that had always been as close as he could come to the same thing. Sheriff Lemuel Crane arrived on the morning of October 7th on a roan horse that moved with the measured authority of an animal that has spent years carrying a man who does not hurry. Crane was 58 years old, a large man gone gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had stopped being readable sometime in his 40s and had since then communicated only what he specifically intended it to communicate, which in most circumstances was very little. He had been sheriff of Harlow Creek for 19 years. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had learned that the distance between fair and unfair was often smaller than people wished it to be, and who had made a career of navigating that distance without falling into either ditch, though the effort of it had left marks. They stood in the yard, the three of them, in the thin October sunshine that gave light without warmth. Crane produced a small notebook from his vest pocket and a pencil worn to half its original length, and licked the tip with the practiced gesture of a man who has taken down many statements and trusts the ritual of it. When did you arrive in Harlow Creek? September 16th. Where were you before that? Cincinnati, Ohio. The Morrison Textile Mill. 12 years. She gave him 2 names without hesitation. The forewoman at the mill and the woman who had run the boarding house, both with addresses on streets she named precisely. Crane wrote them down without comment. Where were you on the night of October 4th? Here. In this cabin. She met his eyes without blinking, without the performance of innocence that guilty people produce, and innocent people sometimes produce by mistake when they understand they are being tested. She simply stated the fact the way she stated all facts, as something that existed independent of whether he chose to believe it. She had the stillness of someone who has nothing to hide, and has learned that stillness itself is the clearest proof of this. Crane looked at Arden. She was here. All night. I would have heard if she'd gone out. The cabin walls are thin and I don't sleep heavily." Crane wrote something in his notebook. He took his time with it, longer than the words required, in the way of a man who uses the writing as thinking space. Then he closed the notebook and tucked it back into his pocket. "I'm not drawing any conclusions. I want to be clear about that. But I need to speak with everyone who came through town recently, and you came through town recently." "I understand. Don't leave the county while I'm looking into this. Either of you. You have it." At the gate he paused without turning around. "Jasper Nell's been talking. I'm telling you that as information, not as accusation." Then he rode on. Cecily went back inside and returned to the stove, and Arden heard the even sound of her resuming her work, the clink of the pot being lifted and replaced, the steady rhythm of someone who has decided that work is the most honest response available and is going to make use of it. He stood at the gate for another minute and watched the road go empty. Sunday came with a frost. The grass was white with it when Arden came out of the barn at first light, his breath coming in small clouds, the cold having the clean bite of a season that has stopped it pretending it might turn back. He scraped ice from the water trough with the back of his hand and watched the sky lighten from black to gray to the pale, uncertain color of early morning that has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to be. When he came into the kitchen, Cecily was dressed. She wore the blue calico, the only dress she had, pressed again in the way she always pressed it without an iron, by folding it carefully and sleeping the night with it under her pillow, so that the weight and warmth of her body worked out the worst of the creases. Her hair was pinned with unusual care, every strand accounted for. She stood at the kitchen window, looking toward the road. "I want to go to church." Arden looked at her reflection in the glass. He had been expecting this and dreading it in equal measure since the morning Crane rode away, since Jasper Nell's eyes had moved to the porch with that measuring quality that meant the old man had already been talking and intended to continue. He thought about what waited in that building on the main street of Harlow Creek. The pews full of people who had spent a week with Jasper Nell's imprecise observations circulating among them like bad water, taking on color and weight with each passing. He thought about Winifred Galt and the expression she had worn in the general store 2 weeks ago. He thought about what it would cost Cecily to walk into that room. He thought about what it would cost her not to. "I reckon that's your call." She turned from the window. Her chin was at the angle he had come to recognize, the specific elevation that meant she had made a decision, and the decision was not negotiable, and she was not asking for his agreement, only for his presence. "Will you take me?" He reached for his hat. The buckboard covered the 11 miles to Harlow Creek in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was full, weighted with things that were being considered rather than things that were being withheld. The frost had retreated from the road but lingered in the shadowed places, in the low ground beside the creek, and under the cottonwoods where the sun had not yet reached. Cecily sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the road ahead with the expression of someone walking toward something difficult, who has decided that looking at it directly is better than looking away. Arden kept his eyes on the horse. He thought about the church, and about the people in it, and about a woman who had walked 40 miles already and was now choosing to walk into something else entirely, not because it was safe, but because surrendering the territory would cost more in the long run than crossing it. He thought he understood that. The church appeared on the edge of town as they came around the last bend, white clapboard walls and a modest steeple. The yard was full. Every horse and buckboard in the county seemed to be present, and the sound of the opening hymn drifted out into the cold morning air, thin and earnest. They walked across the yard. People noticed. A small community notices everything and processes it communally, and the processing had already begun before they reached the steps, heads turning with the careful indirection of people who have decided that staring is beneath them but have not yet decided it is impossible. They climbed the steps. They crossed the threshold. The singing stopped. Not at the end of a verse, not in the natural way of a hymn concluding. It stopped all at once, as if the sound had been a single thing rather than many voices, and someone had simply removed it. The silence that replaced it was immediate and absolute, and had the particular quality of a silence that a great many people are actively choosing to maintain. Arden felt it press against his skin like weather. Every face in the building had turned toward the back. The preacher stood at the pulpit with his hymnal open in his hands and his expression arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who serves both God and community and is aware acutely in this moment that those two obligations are not always the same obligation. He nodded at Arden. A small movement, precise and non-committal. Cecily walked down the center aisle. She walked the way she crossed every difficult room, with her spine arranged as if someone had run a surveyor's line through the center of it, straight and true and tolerating no deviation, her eyes forward, her pace even. She did not look to the left or to the right. She did not acknowledge the silence or the faces or the weight of 50 people's judgment pressing down from every direction. She simply walked to the last pew and sat down. Arden sat beside her. He was aware of Winifred Galt in the third pew from the front, her back turned with a completeness that went past indifference into statement. The preacher cleared his throat. Let us continue with hymn 47. The singing resumed, thin at first, gathering itself gradually, the way spilled water gathers when the floor is uneven. Arden could feel the attention still directed at the back of the room, the way you feel a fire behind you, as heat that has a direction. Cecily opened the hymnal on the rack in front of her and found the page. For a long moment she sat with it open in her hands, her lips pressed together, the muscle below her cheekbone moving once, twice. Her hands on the open hymnal were very still. Then she began to sing, not loudly, not as performance or defiance. Simply as a woman who knows a hymn and has decided that the knowing of it is reason enough to sing it, regardless of who is listening or what they have decided about her. Her voice was low and steady and entirely itself, and it moved through the silence of the congregation the way a single clear note moves through a room that has forgotten music was possible. Nobody joined her. Then Arden did. His voice was rough and unpracticed and had not been used for singing in longer than he could accurately remember. He could not recall the last time he had raised his voice in any room for any purpose that was not practical. He did not sing well. He sang anyway, finding the notes by proximity rather than precision, and the sound of it, the two of them in the last pew, while 50 people sat in chosen silence, was the most public thing he had done in 19 years of living in this town. He felt Galt turn in the third pew. He did not look at her. He kept singing. The hymn had 3 verses. They sang all 3. When the final amen was spoken, the congregation rose with the sound of many people moving at once. The flow of people toward the doors moved around the last pew the way water moves around stones, without contact, without acknowledgement, with the specific choreography of avoidance that requires more effort than most people would admit. No one spoke to them, not one word. Winifred Galt paused near the door, and looked directly at Cecily with a look that contained a verdict that had been reached and would not be reviewed. Cecily met her eyes and held them for 3 full seconds. Then she walked past. 3 miles out on the drive home, she spoke. "There is something you have not told me." It was not a question. Arden's hands tightened on the reins. "The robbery. There is a man named Jasper Nell. His eyes are not good. He has been telling people he saw a woman with brown hair talking to strangers outside town the night before the robbery. He says it was you." The buckboard moved through the dry grass and the cold air. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the brush beside the road, its song unchanged by anything that was happening among the humans within earshot. "I have not been to town except that one time with you." "I know." 2 words. He said them without pause, without the hesitation of a man performing belief or trying to locate it. They were simply true, and he said them the way true things deserve to be said, directly and without decoration. Cecily was very still. Then, "You believe me?" "Yes." Just that. 1 syllable. He did not expand on it or explain it or offer her the scaffolding of his reasoning. He believed her the way he believed the temperature or the direction of the wind, because the evidence of his own perception was sufficient, and he had spent enough years alone to trust his own perception more than the assembled opinions of people who had made up their minds before they had the facts. She faced forward again. He heard the small sound she made, barely audible above the wheels and the horse's hooves, the sound of someone releasing a breath they have been holding since October 5th. The handkerchief in her lap, which she had been worrying into a slow spiral during the drive, went still. They did not speak again until the cabin came into view on the horizon. That night, Cecily did not eat supper. After the dishes were cleared, she went to the porch. He watched through the kitchen window as she settled into the rocking chair, his mother's chair that she had moved to the porch sometime in the 2nd week. The evening had come down cold, and the stars were beginning to appear in the east, small and hard and very far away. He went to the cedar chest by the fireplace and lifted the lid. The blanket was on top. His mother had made it the winter before she got sick, heavy wool in the colors of the valley, brown and gold and the faded green of late summer grass. She had folded it into the chest herself, and he had not moved it since. It smelled of cedar and of something older, the residual presence of a person expressed in the things they handled with care. He took it outside. The porch boards announced him, and Cecily did not turn. He came around the side of the chair and draped the blanket over her shoulders without ceremony, letting it settle and gathering the edges slightly at the front so it would hold. She did not acknowledge this except by pulling it more closely around herself. He turned to go back inside. "Arden." He stopped. Her voice had a quality he had not heard in it before, the quality of something surfacing from a depth where it has been held down for a long time. "Why do you believe me?" He stood with one hand on the doorframe and looked at the darkness beyond the porch rail, at the valley going black under the rising stars. He thought about the cornbread she made every morning. He thought about the root cellar inventory written in her clear, careful hand. He thought about his mother's chair in the afternoon light and the needle moving and the shirts that had been beyond saving until they were not. He thought about the way she had walked down the center aisle of a church full of people who had already decided what she was, with her spine straight and her eyes forward and the absolute absence of apology in her bearing. He thought about a woman who had walked 40 miles through country that did not care whether she lived or died and had arrived at his door not broken, but stripped down to something essential, something that had survived because it was true rather than because it was protected. Ain't nobody who darns socks and keeps a root cellar inventory got robbery in them. He heard her breath catch. A small sound. Barely there. The sound of something that has been braced for impact and finds instead that nothing is coming and does not quite know what to do with the absence of the blow. He went inside and pulled the door closed behind him, gently, without looking back. He stood at the kitchen window with his hands braced against the counter and looked through the glass at the shape of her in the rocking chair, wrapped in his mother's blanket, facing the dark valley. Then her shoulders moved. Not the convulsive movement of someone who has lost control, but the small rhythmic trembling of someone who has been strong for so long in so many directions that the strength has finally found its limit. And the limit is not weakness, but simply the edge of what any person can hold alone. She made no sound. The shaking was silent and contained and entirely private, except that he was watching and could not look away. She had not cried when Arden told her that Fletcher Holm had a wife and 2 children and no ranch. She had not cried when the women in the general store whispered loud enough to be heard. She had not cried when she walked down the center aisle of the church and a building full of people looked at her and decided she was not worth addressing. She cried now, silently in the dark, alone on a porch in Montana, because one man had told her he believed her, and the relief of it was larger than she had known it was going to be. That was the thing about carrying something heavy for a long time. You stopped knowing how heavy it was. You only knew when someone offered to set it down for you, only knew when the absence of the weight hit you all at once. Arden stood at the window until the shaking slowed and stopped, until she lifted her face toward the stars and wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand and sat quietly for a while longer with the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, until she rose and folded the blanket over her arm and came inside. She walked through the kitchen without looking at him. She went to her room. The door closed. He stayed at the window for a long time after, looking at the empty rocking chair on the dark porch, at the place where she had been. Something had cracked open in his chest that first night he heard her moving in the spare room. Some fault line he had not known was there. It had been widening by degrees ever since. He was 40 years old, and he had spent his adult life alone in a cabin that kept getting quieter, and he had told himself that the quiet was what he wanted because it was what he had, and wanting it was more comfortable than mourning it. He was not sure anymore that was entirely true. He was not certain anymore that he wanted the fault line to close. On the morning of October 14th, Jasper Nell made his move. Arden heard about it from Pete Garland at the feed store, where he had gone for the grain that the horses needed before the hard cold set in. Pete was a compact, careful man who had known Arden's father and had never once in 30 years of acquaintance said anything that was not true or at least sincerely believed. He pulled Arden aside between the stacked feed sacks and spoke quietly. Nell went to Crane yesterday, made it official, put his name on a statement saying he saw a brown-haired woman on the Ridgewater Road the evening before the robbery, talking to a man he didn't recognize. Says he's certain of it. Arden said nothing. I've known Jasper Nell for 30 years. Man can't see past his own front fence on a clear day. But Crane has to put it in the record now that it's official. He's going to have to act on it. Pete paused. There's something else. Winifred Galt went to see Crane this morning. Brought 2 other women with her. They're asking him to require the woman to leave the county pending the investigation. Crane hasn't decided yet, but he's under pressure from people he can't entirely afford to ignore. Arden put the grain on the buckboard and drove home. He told Cecily everything that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them and the October wind finding the gaps in the cabin walls. He told her about Nell's official statement and about Galt's visit to Crane and about the pressure that was accumulating in the offices and parlors of Harlow Creek like water behind a dam that was not certain how long it intended to hold. He told her all of it because she had the right to know all of it, and because giving her less than the truth would have been a kind of condescension he was not willing to offer. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, her hands flat on the table, her eyes on the lamp flame. "You believe me?" It was not the question it had been the night before on the porch. It was something else now. An anchor. A thing she was checking was still there. Yes, she nodded. A single, small movement. Something settling. Then she looked up at him. "Thank you. Not for tonight. For all of it." He did not know what to do with that. He poured more coffee they both did not need, and they sat with it cooling in their cups, and did not speak, which was not silence in the old sense, not the silence of a man alone in a cabin that has forgotten what company feels like. It was the silence of two people who have run out of words for the evening and find that the running out is comfortable rather than empty, which is a thing that only happens between people who have, without quite deciding to, begun to trust each other with the parts of themselves that do not have language yet. She was at the door before he heard her. The sound that woke him was not loud. A creak of floorboard, the soft friction of cloth against wood, the specific quality of movement in a small space that is trying not to be heard, which paradoxically makes it more audible to someone whose sleep has always been shallow and whose ears have always done the work his eyes could not do in the dark. He had developed that kind of hearing in his first winter alone, when he was 14, and the sounds of the cabin were entirely strange, and every one of them needed to be identified. He rose and walked barefoot down the hall. The lamp in the front room was burning low, turned down to its minimum, and in its faint light he saw Cecily beside the valise in the corner. She was on her knees, the lid open, her hands moving through the contents with the hurried inaccuracy of someone performing a task that their hands know but their mind is not fully present for. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders, and it struck him as the most private thing he had seen in this cabin, because it was the only time he had seen her without the armor of her daily arrangements. The hair pinned tight was part of what she put on in the morning, the same way the lifted chin was part of what she put on, and here in the low lamplight, she had not yet assembled any of it. She was packing. "What are you doing?" She stopped. Her shoulders pulled forward, curving slightly inward in the involuntary posture of someone expecting a blow. She did not turn around. "I have to go." "Why?" "You heard him. The whole town thinks I did it. Crane is going to come back. Galt is going to push until he does something. I will not stay here and take everything you have built down with me." He crossed the room and stopped in the doorway of the spare room, occupying the space between her and the door with his body. He let the silence hold for a moment. "You are not taking anything down." She rose to her feet. In the low light he could see her face, the red at the rims of her eyes, the particular set of her jaw that was not stubbornness, but something older than stubbornness. The expression of a person who has learned to move before the blow lands because waiting for it is worse. "They will take your land, Arden, your name, everything your father built, and everything you rebuilt after he was gone. They will take all of it because of me. And I am not worth that." She said the last 4 words in a different register than the rest. Lower and flatter and more certain, the way people state things they have believed for a long time and have never said aloud, which makes the saying of them feel like fact rather than feeling. He recognized the register. He had used it himself. Arden looked at her. The lamp guttered in a draft, and the shadows jumped across the walls and settled again. I am not worth that. He had heard people say versions of this before. He had heard it in the voices of men who had lost everything, and women who had been left by everyone, and people who had been told by the world in 100 small and large ways that the accounting of their value came up short. He had said versions of it himself, in the privacy of his own head. In the long winters when the cabin was very quiet, and the silence had a way of agreeing with the worst things you thought about yourself. He knew what the words were made of. He knew what they cost to say. He knew they were not true. Sit down, at the table. I'll make coffee. She looked at him with the expression of someone trying to determine whether what they are being offered is real or whether it is a version of something that will turn out to cost more than it appeared to cost. She had been burned badly by the gap between what was offered and what was real. She had every reason to be cautious about that gap. He waited. She closed the valise. She crossed to the table and sat down. He put the coffee on. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the cottonwoods with the low sound of many leaves letting go all at once, and the night was very dark beyond the window, and the lamp on the table burned steadily between them, and the coffee began to make its slow, reliable sound against the pot, the same sound it made every morning of every day, indifferent to everything, faithful to nothing but its own nature. He sat down across from her and waited for the coffee. After a while, she spoke, her voice quieter than her ordinary voice, the voice of someone speaking in the dark in the middle of the night when ordinary defenses are down. I used to think that if I worked hard enough, I would eventually be past the kind of thing that happened to me in Harlow Creek, that I would earn my way to a place where people could not simply decide I was worth nothing and have that decision carry weight. She looked at the lamp. 12 years and a saved-up ticket and 2,000 miles, and I am still exactly where I started, still the person other people get to have opinions about. Arden poured the coffee. He set hers in front of her. He wrapped both hands around his own cup. That's their doing, not yours. I know that. In my head, I know that. A pause. But the head and the chest keep separate accounts. He looked at her. Yes, they do. That was all. He said it the way plain men say things that are true, without elaboration, without the decoration of empathy performed for an audience. He said it the way two people say things to each other in the middle of the night when they have stopped performing for the other person and are simply being true together. The coffee cooled in their cups. It was 3 o'clock in the morning in a small cabin in Montana, and the hardest part had not yet come. But she had closed the valise. She was sitting at the table. The key was still on the inside of the spare room door. For tonight, Arden told himself, that was enough. She stayed. The valise went back to its corner. The lid stayed closed. In the morning, Cecily made cornbread and coffee and set the table the way she always set it, and if Arden noticed that her hands were steadier than they had been the night before, he said nothing, because some things recover better without being remarked upon. But the town did not stop. Sheriff Crane came back on October 15th with a document he held in both hands the way men hold things they would prefer not to be delivering. He stood in the yard with his hat squared on his head and read from the paper in the formal voice of a man performing an official function and finding it unpleasant. The language was careful and bureaucratic and meant, beneath its careful bureaucratic surface, that Winifred Galt, and 7 other names Arden recognized had signed a formal petition requesting that Cecily be required to vacate Harlow Creek County pending the completion of the robbery investigation. The petition cited disruption to public order. It cited the unresolved nature of the allegations. It cited, in language that managed to be simultaneously vague and unmistakable, the irregular circumstances of her residence at the Voss Ranch. Crane folded the paper when he finished reading it. I don't have the authority to remove her based on a petition alone. What I do have is a formal statement from a witness and a community that is asking me to act on it. The county commissioners are meeting on the 22nd. They have the authority, I don't. If they vote to require her removal, she'll have 7 days. After that, your grazing rights on the common land come under review. The grazing rights. Arden had built his winter feed strategy around the common land for 11 years. Without it, he would need to sell 2 horses before the hard cold arrived, which would mean a spring without the breeding pair he had spent 4 years developing, which would mean a setback of a kind that compounded across seasons. I'm sorry, Arden. He rode away. Cecily came down from the porch. They stood together and looked at the empty road, and the wind moved through the dry grass and carried the smell of coming snow from the north. I should go. Arden turned to look at her. She was looking at the road with the expression of someone who has made a calculation and arrived at an answer they do not want but cannot argue with. If I leave before the 22nd, they have nothing to vote on. Your land stays intact. You get through the winter. It is the logical thing. He looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the particular angle of her chin, the way the October light came down on her face, and found nothing soft to work with because she had put all the softness away somewhere it would not be used against her. He thought about what logic had gotten her the last time she had relied on it. He thought about a ticket bought on the logic of careful letters and careful words and the reasonable expectation that people mean what they write. Is that what you want? She was quiet for a long moment. No. But what I want has not historically been a reliable guide to what I should do. He turned back to the road. We will wait for the 22nd. The news came through Pete Garland on the morning of October 19th. Mrs. Winifred Galt had taken a fall from her horse the previous evening on the road back from the Whitmore farm. Her shoulder had been badly wrenched. Her hip was bruised deep enough to keep her off her feet for some days. The doctor was coming from Ridgewater in the morning. Arden came inside and told Cecily plainly and without editorial. She was quiet for a moment. Then she took her coat from the hook by the door. Where are you going? She looked at him. The expression on her face was not warm and not cold. It was the expression of a woman who has made a decision based on something older than the current circumstances and is not interested in explaining it. She needs someone. The doctor won't be there until morning. Arden picked up his own coat. I'll hitch the buckboard. They arrived at Galt's house as the last light was leaving the sky. Galt's neighbor answered the door, and the expression on her face when she saw Cecily moved through several stages before settling on something that was not welcome but was not refusal either, which was sufficient. Cecily worked for 2 hours. She had brought the small kit she kept from her grandmother's remedy book, the arnica and the clean linen, and the things that help with deep bruising when there is nothing else available. She wrapped the shoulder with the practiced sureness of someone who has learned from a book and from necessity and from paying close attention when things hurt and when they helped. She elevated the hip with rolled blankets. She made a tea from dried willow bark she had found in the root cellar and had been keeping for exactly this kind of need. Galt lay in her bed and said nothing for most of it. She was not a woman who showed discomfort easily, and she was not showing it now, though Cecily could see it in the set of her shoulders and the way she held her breath when the shoulder was moved. She bore it with the same iron composure she brought to everything, which Cecily respected even while she was treating the consequences of the pride that composure sometimes created. When Cecily rose to go, Galt spoke. Her voice came out rough from the pain in the evening and something else that was harder to name. Why? Cecily picked up her kit. Because you needed someone. Same reason anyone does anything. She walked out. In the buckboard on the way home, Arden did not say anything for a long time. You didn't have to do that. Cecily looked straight ahead at the dark road. I know. He looked at her profile in the moonlight. He thought about what it cost, what it specifically cost, to go to the house of someone who had publicly decided you were not worth addressing and spend 2 hours helping them. Not for forgiveness, not for reciprocity, not because the help would change anything about the situation, but because a person needed help and not going had never been a real option. He thought about the kind of character that produced that action, the kind you do not learn and do not perform, the kind you either have or you do not. He kept his eyes on the road and said nothing else and let the silence carry what he could not say. On the morning of October 20th, Fletcher Holm came to the ranch. Arden saw the buggy from the barn, the dark horse, and the neat black vehicle that belonged to a man who considered appearances worth maintaining. And he knew before the driver stepped down who it was. Fletcher Holm was 44 years old, a solid man with the careful grooming of someone who understood that how you present yourself in a small town is a form of continuous argument. He wore his good coat. His boots were clean. He had the face of a man who has done something he knows was wrong, and has spent considerable time since then constructing a framework in which it was not, or was at least understandable, which he has come to experience as the same thing. He did not open the gate. He stood on the roadside of it and looked at Cecily on the porch with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite defiance, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. Miss Brant. Cecily came down the porch steps and crossed the yard. She stopped on her side of the gate. 6 feet of cold air and a wooden rail between them. She said nothing. She waited, because she had learned long ago that silence is the more powerful position when the other person needs to speak and knows it. Holm looked at the gate rather than at her. I understand that what happened has placed you in a position that is not fair to you. He said it with the slight emphasis of a man who considers the acknowledgement itself a form of generosity. Cecily waited. I have a family. Dorothea, the children. He looked up then. Whatever his failings were, the fear in his eyes when he spoke of his family was genuine. If this situation continues, if it comes out fully, what I did, the children are 6 and 8 years old. The cold morning air sat between them without movement. Cecily looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way she had looked at everything since she arrived in Montana, directly and without performance, with the quiet attention of a woman who has decided that seeing things accurately is more important than seeing them in the way that would be most comfortable. Then she spoke. You wrote me letters for 3 months. You wrote about the ranch and the clean air and the good land. You wrote about a man who was waiting for the right person. You put those words on paper and you sent them to a woman who was working 12 hours a day in a textile mill and had nothing but those words to look forward to. Holmes said nothing. I sold everything I owned. I bought a one-way ticket. I waited 2 days at your depot. Then I walked 40 miles. She let that sit. You are asking me to think about what is fair to your family. I think you should have thought about fairness before you wrote the first letter." Something moved through Holmes' face, something that had the shape of the acknowledgement he had not quite managed to make before, arriving late and insufficient and real. Cecily looked at him for one more moment. "I will not destroy your family. That was never something I intended. But I will also not disappear, because it is convenient for you. I am here. I intend to remain here. What you do with that is your concern." She turned and walked back to the cabin. She did not look back. Arden had stood through all of it at the fence post 10 feet to the right of the gate, close enough to be present, far enough to give her the space to do what she needed to do without his interference. He had not spoken. He had not moved toward home. He had simply stood there in the cold morning with his hands at his sides, which was its own kind of statement. Home looked at him. Arden looked back. There was nothing to say. Home climbed back into his buggy and turned the horse toward town. Arden watched him until the road took him around the first bend and the sound of the wheels faded into the frozen grass. Then he turned. Cecily was on the porch with both hands on the rail, looking at the mountains in the north, her knuckles white against the wood. He walked to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. "You did that well." She did not turn around. Her knuckles stayed white. "I am so angry. I have been angry since the depot, since the bench I slept on, since I started walking. I have been keeping it somewhere. It would not make things worse." She turned then. Her eyes were dry and very bright. "I am so tired of keeping it somewhere." He looked at her. At the brightness in her eyes and the white knuckles and the 29 years of a woman who had been making the best of inadequate situations since she was 17 years old and had somewhere along the way decided that the making of the best was a virtue rather than a sentence and had lived accordingly. "You can put it down here, if you need to." She looked at him for a long moment. Then the white knuckles released the rail. She breathed out. It was not a dramatic moment. It did not involve tears or declarations or any of the visible paraphernalia of release. It was simply a woman who had been holding herself together for a very long time, choosing, for one specific moment on a cold October morning on a porch in Montana, not two. She sat down in the rocking chair. He sat on the porch steps. They stayed there until the cold drove them inside. The county commissioners met on October 22nd. Arden went alone. The meeting was held in the back room of the bank, which had the specific irony of being the building that had been robbed and which was now being used to adjudicate the fate of the woman being accused of participating in the robbery. 8 men sat around the long table. Crane was present, but not voting. Arden stood at the end of the table and said what he knew. He said it plainly and without ornament, the way he said everything, the way he had learned to say things in a life where plain speech was the only kind he had ever had patience for. He said that Cecily Brandt had been in his cabin on the night of October 4th. He said that Jasper Nell's eyesight was a matter of record in this town and had been for a decade. He said that the woman who had kept his root cellar and mended his shirts and planted flowers in his dirt was not a person who robbed banks, and that he would put everything he owned against the truth of that if the commissioners required it. There was discussion. It had the quality of discussion that has already reached its conclusion and is performing deliberation as a courtesy to the form of the thing. They voted 6-2. Cecily had 7 days, beginning October 22nd, ending October 29th. Arden drove home in the dark. He sat in the buckboard on the frozen road with the stars very clear and very cold above him, and the horse finding its own way home because it knew the road better than he did in the dark. And he thought about 7 days, and about the grazing rights, and about a woman who had walked 40 miles on a broken promise, and had still, somehow, not stopped believing that the next thing she tried might be different. The cabin came into view on the horizon, the window lit from inside, the warm square of it in the cold dark. She had left the lamp on. He had not asked her to leave the lamp on. She had simply done it, the way you do things for people when you have begun to understand what they need before they name it, the way warmth moves toward cold without being asked, the way water finds the low places in the earth not through intention but through nature. He stopped the buckboard and sat with the reins in his hands and looked at the light in the window for a long moment before he got down. Through the wall of the barn he could hear the faint sound of the cabin, the creak of the rocking chair on the porch, steady and patient, the sound of someone waiting without urgency, as if she had decided that whatever came through the door was something she was ready for. He walked toward the light. On October 26th, 4 days before the deadline, the telegram arrived. Crane brought it himself, which told Arden everything about its contents before the man opened his mouth. The sheriff dismounted in the yard with the expression of a man who has received information that requires him to revise something he would have preferred not to revise. Cecily came out onto the porch. Crane looked at her. "We got a wire from the sheriff in Ridgewater. 4 men were apprehended 2 days ago attempting to rob the general store there. They confessed to the Harlow Creek job. All of it. The date, the amount, the route they took out of town that night. The October wind moved through the yard. There was no woman with them. Not one. All 4 men, working alone, same as they had in 3 other counties going back 2 years. The woman Jasper Nell saw on the Ridgewater Road, she was the wife of one of them, passing through to meet the group further south. Yellow hair, pale as corn silk. He did not look up when he said the next part. Nothing like yours. The silence held. Cecily stood on the porch with her hands at her sides. Miss Brant, I was wrong. I should have looked harder before I let it go as far as it did. I am sorry for it. Cecily looked at him. The moment stretched. Thank you for telling me. 4 words, precise and complete. Not a closing of the door, not an opening of it. Simply the acknowledgement that the information had been received by a woman who would decide in her own time what to do with everything that had preceded it. Crane nodded once. At the gate, he stopped. You were right about her. I should have listened sooner. Then he was gone. Arden stood in the yard and did not move for a moment. Then he turned. Cecily was still on the porch, her face turned slightly away, toward the mountains, toward the place where the sky came down to meet the land in the long, clean line of the western ridge. He crossed the yard. He came to the foot of the porch steps and stopped. He reached out and touched her elbow, just briefly, just enough to let her know he was there, that this was real, that the morning had changed and he had witnessed it and she was not standing in it alone. She did not pull away. His hand dropped back to his side. They stood together in the cold morning light and watched the dust settle on the road that had brought them both more than either of them had asked for, and the valley stretched away in every direction, enormous and unhurried, entirely unconcerned with the small human business of being wronged and being cleared and standing in the aftermath trying to determine what comes next. The marigold stems by the porch steps had gone to seed, but the stems were still standing. The apologies came the way most unwelcome things come, one at a time and without warning. Martha Coalfield from the dry goods counter arrived first on the afternoon of October 27th in her Sunday buckboard on a Thursday. She carried a covered dish balanced on both palms, a pie by the shape of it, the cloth over it still carrying the warmth of a kitchen that had produced it within the last 2 hours. Cecily met her in the yard. Apple. Made it this morning. Cecily took it. The tin was warm through the cloth. Martha opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again with the expression of a woman who has prepared remarks and found them insufficient now that she is standing in front of the person they are addressed to. I should have... The sentence did not find its ending. Cecily looked at the dish in her hands, the warm tin, the careful cloth covering, the pie made this morning by a woman who had stood in her store and allowed her silence to mean something it should not have meant, who had positioned herself so that her back was a statement and her whisper was a verdict. She thought about all the ways she could receive this. She thought about what it would cost to take the full warmth of the gesture and what it would cost to refuse it entirely, and she arrived, as she arrived at most things, at the point of precision between those two. Thank you, Martha. 3 words, polite and measured, the precise temperature of an acknowledgement that receives the gesture without receiving everything the gesture is meant to substitute for. Not cold enough to be cruelty, not warm enough to be absolution. Martha had earned neither the cold nor the full warmth, and Cecily was not in the business of giving people things they had not earned. Martha nodded quickly, too quickly, with the relief of a woman who has been permitted to leave a room she should not have entered the way she entered it. She climbed back into her buckboard and drove away without looking back. Cecily carried the pie inside and set it on the table and lifted the cloth and looked at the golden crust for a long moment, the careful crimped edges, the small vented slits in the top through which the filling had bubbled and caramelized. She cut 2 slices. She set one in front of Arden, who had come in from the barn when he heard the buckboard, and who sat across from her now with the expression of a man who has understood the entire exchange from the doorway and is waiting to follow her lead. They ate the pie. It was good pie. Neither of them said so. Reverend Aldous Hatch came on Saturday morning. He was a thin man with the patient eyes of someone who has spent a long career watching people behave badly and has managed, through sustained effort, not to lose his fundamental belief in their capacity for better. He walked up the path with his Bible tucked under his arm and his hat in his hand, which was a courtesy he had clearly decided upon before he arrived. He said what he had come to say with the directness of a man who has had some practice with difficult conversations and has learned that the longer the approach, the more the apology costs the person receiving it. The congregation understood, he said, that they had acted on incomplete information and had treated her accordingly, which was not the treatment a person deserves on incomplete information or on any other kind. He said that she would be welcome on Sunday, and that he meant welcome in the full sense of the word, and not merely in the technical sense of not being asked to leave. He said all of this looking at her steadily, with no evasion in his eyes and no performance in his posture, just a man delivering an honest statement and prepared to receive an honest response. "I will think about it, Reverend." Her voice carried no hardness and no warmth, the temperature of a woman who is not yet ready to decide and is honest enough not to perform readiness she does not feel. It was the same tone she used for most things that required her to maintain distance from her own feelings while she sorted through them. Hatch nodded. He had the grace not to push. He touched his hat and walked back down the path, and Cecily watched him go and then turned back to her pots on the porch. And the water poured out in a thin, steady stream over the dormant soil, patient and without urgency, as if she were keeping something alive that had not yet decided what it intended to become. The letter from Jasper Nell arrived on Monday. Cecily found it on the porch. A folded piece of brown paper with her name written on the outside in handwriting so unsteady it barely qualified as letters. Each one a small separate negotiation between intention and result. She brought it inside and sat at the table and opened it. Arden sat across from her with his coffee. She read it aloud. My eyes ain't what they used to be. I seen what I thought I seen, but I seen wrong. I am sorry for the trouble it caused you. The signature at the bottom was 3 attempts at the same name, each one slightly different, as if Jasper Nell had needed several tries to commit to the fact of himself. She folded it along its original creases, smoothed the edges with her fingertips. He did not come himself. Arden said nothing. His knees are bad. Not a defense, just a fact, offered carefully. Cecily looked at the folded paper. His knees were not too bad to stand at the feed counter and tell everyone in this county that I was a thief. There was no answer to that. It was simply true, and they both knew it was true, and the knowing of it sat in the room between them without requiring any further attention. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long moment, looking at the careful folds, the unsteady handwriting, the old man's name written 3 times because once was not enough to hold. Then she rose from the table. She crossed to the cedar chest by the fireplace. She opened the lid and placed the letter inside. She closed the lid. She stood with her hand on the wood for a moment. I am not ready to forgive him, but I am not ready to burn it either. She went to the stove and began making breakfast. Arden sat with his coffee and watched her move through the kitchen, the particular economy of her movements, the way she reached for things without looking, because she knew where they were now, because this kitchen had become her kitchen in the way that spaces become ours, incrementally and without ceremony, one repeated gesture at a time. The cabinet where the cups lived, the second drawer for the good knife, the spot on the shelf where the coffee tin belonged. She had learned all of it without being taught, the way you learn a place you have decided to stay in. After a while, she began to hum. It was soft and low, barely audible above the sound of the stove and the October wind at the window. A tune he did not recognize, half-formed, the kind of melody a person hums when they are not thinking about it, when they are simply present in their own body in a quiet room, and the sound is just what that presence produces. He had not heard her hum since before the church, since before the weight of the town's judgment had settled over the cabin like weather that does not announce itself and does not leave quickly. He looked out the window at the valley. The marigold stems by the porch rail had gone entirely to seed, dry and pale, their summer color reduced to the memory of color. But the seeds were there. He knew enough about growing things to know that the seeds were there, small and dry and carrying everything the summer had been, waiting for conditions that did not yet exist. He drank his coffee and said nothing. It was enough. That evening, Cecily brought the valise out. Not the half-packed, midnight, desperate version of the valise. This was deliberate. She carried it from the spare room to the kitchen table in both arms, set it down with the care of someone handling a thing that is heavy in ways that are not entirely about weight, and stood looking at it for a moment before she reached for the clasp. Arden was in the doorway. She did not ask him to leave. She opened the lid. Inside, the few things that remained. She had burned most of the letters the first night, fed them into his stove in the precise and unhurried way of someone completing a task that had to be done. A few had survived, the ones she had kept as proof, the ones she had shown to Crane in the early days when proof still seemed like something that would help. They lay at the bottom of the valise in their envelope, Fletcher Holmes' careful handwriting on the outside, the return address of a store on Carpenter Street where a man with a white fenced house had spent 3 months composing a fiction about himself. She took the envelope out. She carried it to the stove. She opened the iron door. The letters went in one at a time, the same way they had gone in the first night, the same deliberate pace, the same watching as the paper curled and the ink blackened and the words became heat and then became nothing. The kitchen filled with the clean, sharp smell of burning paper, and the light from the open stove door moved across her face and made it gold and shadow alternately. And Arden stood in the doorway and did not move. This was the second burning. The first had been grief and shock, and the necessity of action when there was nothing else to act on. This one was different. This one was a door being closed from the inside, deliberately, with full knowledge of what the closing meant. The difference between the two was the difference between surviving something and choosing what came after. When the last letter was gone, she closed the stove door. She returned to the table. She reached into her apron pocket and placed 3 things on the table in front of her, setting each one down with the care of someone arranging something that matters. The first was a handkerchief. His handkerchief, the one he had handed her the first night when she sat shivering by the stove, worn thin at the edges from years of laundering before it ever reached her, soft as old paper. She had washed it and kept it, and she placed it on the table now with the deliberateness of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and why. The second was a marigold. Pressed flat and dried between 2 pieces of paper, its petals faded from the sharp gold of late summer to the color of old honey, its shape still perfectly preserved. The first one she had cut from the garden she had planted in October in the dirt beside the porch steps. The garden she had planted assuming a future. The future that had arrived. The third was a small piece of paper, folded twice. She opened it and smoothed it flat on the table. One word, written in her clear, economical hand. She looked at the 3 things for a moment. Then she placed them into the bottom of the valise, the handkerchief first, the marigold on top of it, the paper last, folded again, and set carefully against the side. She closed the lid. She latched the clasp. She picked the valise up and carried it back to the spare room, and when she came out, she did not have it with her, and there was something different in the way she moved, something that had been subtracted, a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped knowing its name. "What are you doing?" She looked at him. In the lamplight, her eyes held the look of someone who has set down a very heavy thing and is standing in the new lightness of the moment before they decide what to pick up next. The specific expression of a person at a beginning rather than an ending. Starting over. And she smiled. Not the small, careful version she sometimes permitted herself. The controlled movement at the corners of her mouth that could be retracted if necessary. This was the full version, the one that reached her eyes, the one that had been waiting behind everything else for a long time, and had finally decided the room was safe enough to occupy. He did not know what to do with it. He did the only thing that seemed appropriate, which was to stand there and let it land. They sat on the porch that night, under a sky that had gone entirely clear. The stars so dense and close, they seemed to be pressing down toward the earth with the weight of all that cold light. The temperature had dropped since sundown, and their breath came in small visible clouds that dissolved immediately into the darkness. The bench was narrow. Their shoulders touched. Not almost touched, the way they had been almost touching for weeks. The careful maintenance of the space between two people who are aware of each other in ways they have not yet addressed, actually touched, warm pressure through the fabric of their respective coats, steady and mutual and acknowledged by neither of them because some things are more real before they are spoken. Cecily looked at the valley. Arden looked at the valley. The coyotes started somewhere to the south. One voice, and then an answer from the ridge. The ancient call and response of creatures that have been having the same conversation since before anyone was listening. The sound wove through the cold air and settled into the silence between notes, and the silence was part of the music. She spoke first. That first night, when you found me on the road, why did you stop? He had asked himself this question many times in the weeks since, had turned it over in the way you turn over a stone to see what lives underneath, expecting something that would explain the whole thing, finding instead only more questions and the persistent fact of what he had done. He had stopped because the horse stopped. He had stopped because it was raining. He had stopped because she was there and the alternative was riding past. And something in him had looked at the alternative and found it impossible in a way he could not fully articulate. He had not known then that he was making a choice that would matter. You rarely do. Don't know. Just did. She nodded slowly. That is what I thought. She leaned back against the bench and her head tilted until it rested against his shoulder, light as a decision made carefully and without reservation, the weight of it less than he expected, and more significant than anything he had felt in a very long time. He did not move. My mother used to say that the people who matter find us when we need them, not before. I used to think she was being poetic. She turned her face toward his. In the starlight, her eyes were dark and clear, holding the sky's reflection in their depth, and he was close enough now to see the small details he had been cataloging without knowing he was cataloging them. The faint line of the old scar at her temple, the way her lashes were darker at the base, the fact that when she was thinking seriously about something, the space between her brows drew together in a way that was barely visible and entirely legible. Now I think she was just paying attention. He looked at her. All the things he could not say gathered in his chest and pressed against the inadequacy of language, the specific frustration of a man who has lived his whole life in the gap between what he feels and what he knows how to express, who has managed that gap for so long he has almost made peace with it, except for moments like this one, when it seems like the most important and solvable problem he has ever encountered. He did not speak. Instead, he let his hand move across the worn wood of the bench, slowly, with the deliberateness of a person making a choice at each incremental stage and choosing to continue, until his fingers found hers where they rested on the bench between them. She did not pull away. Her hand turned just slightly, just enough, and her fingers closed around his with the quiet certainty of someone who has been waiting for exactly this and had decided some time ago what they would do when it arrived. They sat like that. The stars moved in their ancient arcs overhead, the same stars that had been moving since before this valley existed, that would continue moving after every human thing in it had become something else entirely. The mountains stood in the dark to the north, enormous and permanent and utterly unconcerned. The coyotes finished their conversation, and the silence that followed was the best kind, full rather than empty, inhabited. After a while, clouds began to gather in the west, moving in from beyond the ridge, dark shapes obscuring the stars in a slow progression from the horizon inward. Cecily watched them. It is going to rain tomorrow. He looked at the clouds. at the particular weight and color of them. The way they moved with the purposeful unhurry of weather that has decided where it is going and is in no rush to arrive. He had been reading weather in this valley for 20 years, and the cloud said rain, and the rain meant the garden, and the garden had been planted by her hands in October in ground that she had believed would be hers to tend through the seasons that came after. Reckon so. She smiled again, the full version, and turned her face back toward the night. Good. The garden needs it. She rose from the bench. Her hand left his. She stood for a moment with her fingers on the door handle, her back to him, the lamp inside casting her shadow long across the porch boards, and the night air was cold and smelled of coming rain and the faint residual green of the last things still growing in the frozen ground. Good night, Arden. He looked at her, at the line of her shoulders against the lamplight, at the dark hair pinned at the back of her neck, at the door handle under her hand and the spare room beyond it where a valise sat in the corner with a marigold and a handkerchief and a folded piece of paper that said the one word that covered everything. Good night, Cecily. She went inside. The door closed behind her with a sound that was the smallest possible sound a door can make when it closes, careful and complete. He heard her footsteps cross the kitchen, the soft creak of the floorboards down the hall, the quiet of the spare room door settling into its frame. Then the cabin was still. He sat alone on the bench with the darkness all around him, and the cold coming down from the mountains and the clouds moving in from the west, and the faint smell of rain already present in the air, the smell of something that has been building for a long time and is finally ready to arrive. The bench beside him held the warmth of where she had been. He did not move away from it. He sat with it until the first distant sound came from the west, the low murmur of thunder so far off it was barely distinguishable from the wind, and the clouds covered the last of the stars, and the darkness became complete and particular and full of the promise of rain. It was going to rain. The garden needed it. He thought about seeds in frozen ground, about things that go down in autumn and come up in spring as something you could not have predicted from the seed, about the way certain things require darkness and cold and patience before they can become what they are made to be, about the way you cannot rush any of it, about the way trying to rush it was the one thing guaranteed to prevent it. He thought about a woman who had walked 40 miles on broken shoes and arrived at a stranger's door with 11 pounds of a life and $3.40, and the unbroken conviction that what she was worth had not yet been accurately appraised, who had spent 6 weeks proving that conviction correct in ways that required no announcement, only presence and work and the willingness to plant something in October ground and believe it would come up. He thought about cornbread and mended shirts and a root cellar inventory in clear economical handwriting and marigolds pressing through dry October ground. He thought about a hand that had turned in his and held on. The first raindrop hit the porch rail, then another. Then the rain began in earnest, steady and sure, the way things begin when they have been a long time coming and have finally found their moment, falling on the cabin roof and the barn and the frozen garden and the road that curved away toward Harlow Creek and the road that curved back from it, falling on the mountains and the valley and the dry grass and the seeds in the ground, falling on everything equally and without preference. The way rain falls, the way certain things fall, not because they have chosen a target, but because falling is simply their nature, and the earth below is simply there to receive them. Arden went inside. He left the lamp burning in the window, not for any particular reason, just because it seemed like the right thing to do. There is a quiet that settles after a story like this one. Something tender sits in the chest. Not quite sadness, not quite joy, just a fullness that does not need a name. Many of us have stood where Cecily stood on a road we did not expect, holding something that no longer meant what it once did. Some of us have been silent too, living so long in silence that we forgot what it sounded like to have someone else breathing in the next room. And perhaps you have known what it is to be believed when the world had already made up its mind, or to believe someone when believing was the harder choice. These things stay with us. Thank you for staying until the rain.